Okay. Zok Tehillah the Gemara. Tanur Abba. The Gemara brings like four brises that talks about the Lesach Shemeshar Bedisha. Tanur Abba Dayish. Ma Dayish Miyuchad. Davar Shekadula Karka. What is the animal working on? Something that grows from the ground. Grain. Uvashas Gemar Malacha. It's at the time of the Gemar Malacha. Because the threshing is sort of one of the last steps in the process of preparing grain in Sidra the Pas. And the Torah says a poil can eat from it. What does this exclude? Yotza hachoylev, someone who's working for somebody else, milking his cows. Mechabetz, I'm not sure what that is exactly. Rashi teaches it minei charitze chalov, some of the output when you get milk to some other byproducts there. Magavin, then someone who's making cheese. Why are all these not authorized for the worker to be able to eat some? She'ein gidoy lo karka. They don't grow. They're not growing from the ground. They grow from the animal. Okay. The ain poil, and therefore a poil is not allowed to eat. Why do we need this special limud from Daesh? We already know this halacha from what we learned yesterday. It says in the pasuk that talks about the heter for a poil to eat. We learned it from V'chisave beken reyacha that just like kerem is just like grapes are gedei lekarka, so too only gedei lekarka. The more Israel, we need a secondary limud. Remember, we learned kama, the rabbis called balakama to include anything that grows not only grain. So maybe kama is even more inclusive than that. Maybe it's the rabbis nami midi delav gidir lekarkanin. Who? Kamashman daish, that it's limited to something that grows from the ground, not milk and cheese. That was the first brisa about daish. Second brisa about daish. Tanya idach daish. Ma daish miyuchad davar shebeshas kamar malacha. At the time of the Gemar Malacha, the poil can eat the last part of the process. Of kol shahu, the shas Gemar Malacha, so to anything that's at the Gemar Malacha, poil oichel boy, the poil can eat them. Yotam menachish. This excludes any type of work that's done during the growth of a plant. That's not at the end of the growth. That's at the beginning of the growth, the middle of the growth. Therefore, workers in that field will not be able to eat from what they're working on. Specifically, yotam and nachesh b'shumim, somebody who is pulling out the smaller garlics, psolim and onions, to make room for the healthier ones to grow. It's like taking out a weed almost. Since that's not the Gemar Malacha, it's just part of the ongoing process of helping the healthy bulbs grow. Ain poil oichel them. There, the poil wouldn't be able to eat there as he's working. Why do I need daish? It told me that. Again, in the pasuk of Chisave b'kemer it says of el kelecha el kel yichaloi, and we learn from there that we're talking about when you're putting it into your bilim's kalim. You're at the time. What are you doing now? You're putting these fruits into the kalim of the owner. You're not allowed to put them into your kalim. So we know clearly that the only heter to eat is at the final stage, at the Gemar Malacha during the harvest. So you should know from there, Nafka. The Gemara Loy Tricha, because we're speaking about a different case. Abagab the Kamishlev Ketini Mibeni Alibi. And Rashi says, yes, they would pull these little onions and little garlics out that were never really going to grow fully to allow the other ones to grow more healthy. But you know what they did with those that they pulled out? They ate them. They used them. So you might think that legabe, those pears, it's the Gemar Malacha. Even though legabe, the big picture, it's not the Gemar Malacha. So you might think it's allowed, Kamash Lon Dayish, that until we're at the final stage of the big picture, the worker is not allowed to eat from it. Tanya Idach, we learned in the Brisa, Dayish. Another halacha we learned from Dayish. Ma Dayish miyuchad davar shaloi nigamur amalachtai lamaiser. Dayish, when you are doing the threshing, it's on a davar that's not mochuber lakarka. It's already cut down. It's already talush. But it's still not yet nigmar malachta lemaiser. So only before the gemar malacha lemaiser, poil oichel boy, av kol shaloi nigmar malachta lemaiser, poil oichel boy. Yotza, what does it exclude? Haboidel but tamarim with groigres. If you had tamarim and groigres, figs and dates that were squashed together, and someone was hired to separate them into individual fruit, that's post the gemar malacha, and the chi of trumas and maises were already chal on it. Hoil v'nigmar malachta lemaiser ain't poil oichel boy. So let's just pause for a second, because Rashi told us earlier that it's not anything to do with the fact that it's chayiv and meiser. The reason why I can't eat it as a poil is not because it's chayiv and meiser. Rashi tells us that even if it was in chutz la'aretz where there is no chiyav trumas and meisers, I'm still not allowed to eat it. Chiyav meiser is merely a litmus test to determine from a choshen mishpedeka perspective until when am I allowed to eat the pears of the employer. But it's not connected to the fact that it's also to eat, because even if it was nigmara malachta lemaiser, and from a yerideh perspective, you're allowed to eat it. It's not tevel because there is no chiv meiser on this particular fruit. Nevertheless, it's still also for a poil to eat it. Frek the Gemara about Tanya, we learned haboidel b'tamarim uvegragreis poil oichel boy. We learned the brayse that it says exactly the opposite. That in fact, doing this exact malacha is it's not considered past the gemar malacha, and in fact, the boil is allowed to eat from it. Omar Papa, that brayse that says there's no gemar malacha is in a specific case. Kitanya hi besuchlani. Suchlani are dates and figs that were never going to really grow fully. So they would pick them off the tree and they would put them into a basket made out of palm leaves, and they would be nisbashal there. They would cook there. I'm not sure if it means ferment, but it did ongo some natural process. And that's what we're talking about over here. We're talking about when they're picking these to put them into the palm baskets, but before they were nisbashal. So therefore, for these particular items, the gemar malacha had not yet occurred, and that's why the brayse tells us that yotza boidel b'tmam v'gregreis, boidel b'tmam v'gregreis poil oichel. Zokta gemara vayte. Tanya Yidich, another brayse about something that we're learning from Daesh. Ma Daesh miyuchad davar shaloyin gemara malachta lechala. Daesh, you have grains that are threshed. It's not nigmar malachta lechala, because when does the chi of chala trigger? When you mix the flour with the water by the lisha. By the lisha point. So when we just have grain, it's well before that point, so there's no chiyuv yet triggered for challah. Yotza, this would exclude halosh. If you're in the middle of kneading dough, that's what you're doing for your employer. You wouldn't be able to eat from it because that's already post gemar malacha for challah. V'amekatef is forming the dough, v'oifen baking the dough. Because these are all post.
So Yosy, so sorry to interrupt. So chocolate chip cookie dough.
They have already gemar malach lechala. The ain't poil oichel boy there. A poil cannot eat from it. I'm sorry. What were you asking?
I'm sorry to have interrupted. But so no chocolate chip cookie dough, which is gemar malachta in a sense, before like not like
separate challah. The chiv to separate challah is the moment the flour mixes with the water.
Okay.
So if you have that dough and you're forming the cookies, you're not allowed to eat from it.
Right, but so but chocolate chip cookie dough doesn't have challah in it, but it's considered finished. That's what I mean. Nobody's going to eat raw cookie dough.
So what you're asking me is, what about if I'm making a dough that would not be mechuyev in challah, like pas habal b'kisnin?
Yeah.
So that's a very good point. I still think the litmus test would work. If it was regular dough at this stage, the poil may no longer eat from it, even though there's no chiyuv challah in this particular instance. Nevertheless, the poil can no longer eat from it because, like I said, it's just a litmus test. Has nothing to do with the fact that it became tevel.
Okay.
A good point. Frek the Gemara, I don't understand. By the time you're kneading dough, you're way, way, way past the period of dosh. And we already said that once the dosh is done, it's nigmar malachta l'maiser. And at that point and on, the poil is no longer allowed to eat from it. So where would it ever be relevant that the cutoff would be at the point of lush? The cutoff has long occurred because at the point where it was merely grain, where the chiyah for meiser had already been triggered, at that point you're no longer allowed to eat from it as a poil. We're speaking in chutz la'aretz to leka meiser. We take off challah in chutz la'aretz, but we're not mafresh meisers. So if you're living in chutz la'aretz, there's no chiyuv meiser, there the cutoff is later. Frag the Gemara, how could you say that? Ihachi challah nami leka. In chutz la'aretz, there wouldn't be challah either. Ella, now nowadays we do take challah, but Tosfos speaks out that it's only midrabanan. Ella la'olam ba'aretz. We're really speaking all in Eretz Yisrael, but it's at a period of time where there was already a chiyuv challah, but there was not yet a chiyuv for trumas and maishrus. And when was that? It took 14 years from when they crossed the Yarden and entered Eretz Yisrael until they had conquered all of the land and had already distributed to all of the Yidden. And during those 14 years, there was a chiyuv challah, but there was no chiyuv trumas and maishrus, and Rashi shortly will tell us why. Damar Mar, sheva shekivshu v'sheva shechilku, nischayvu b'challah, v'loy nischayvu b'maiser. And Rashi tells us it's because of a different expression in the Torah. When the Torah tells us about the chiyuv maiser, it says ki savoyu ala oretz, when you come to the land, and then it says the place where Hashem chose to rest His Shekhinah. And we learn from there that it's not just when you come into the land, it's when you, at the point where we could make a permanent dwelling for the Shekhinah in Gilgal. So once they had more of a permanent dwelling for the Shekhinah in Gilgal, that's when the Chiyuv of Ma'aser got kicked in. But the logic that the Torah uses when the Torah tells us about the Chiyuv Challah is not ki savoyu el haaretz. It's bivoy achem el haaretz. That has a connotation of as soon as you get into Eretz Yisrael, before anything, you're already chayiv and chal. So during this period of time, it would have been relevant that the Gemara Malacha for Challah would be relevant because Ma'aser is not relevant. Now, there's a lot of kashas on this. The first of which is we said a minute ago that it's not the chiyuv truma or the chiyuv meiser that makes it usher for the poil to eat. That's just a litmus test. That's the one the cutoff date is. So what's it negeya if at this point in time there's a chiyuv to take meiser or not? It's just a litmus test on how long the Torah granted employees the right to eat. Frank the Gemara, midi meiser kagar. The chiyuv meiser has nothing to do with the isser for the poil to eat. Gemar malacha kagar. It's only because of the Gemar malacha. We're just using meiser as a litmus test as to when the Gemar malacha is. But it doesn't actually matter. It doesn't actually matter if, in fact, there's a chiyuv meiser here or not. So the whole thing is fair now. Where is it ever relevant that the Gemar malacha is lisha if the Gemar malacha for meiser was so much at an earlier stage? It's long also already for the poil to eat from this food as soon as it was already dosh. Ravina, or
so Yosy, just if I could just back up a second here I know it's a little bit of a sidebar regarding the chiyuv of trumas and maisros versus challah, but is it also logical? The challah, somebody buys and bakes, it doesn't matter where the flour came from, but he makes the dough at home, he's going to be mechuyev in challah. Trumas and maisros, if I buy from a goy, I have no chiyuv of trumas and maisros. We know that. So who owned the land before it was divided? It was still owned technically by the goyim. Why would it have a chiyuv of trumas and maisros? When were they growing anything to make the chiyuv of trumas and maisros applicable?
So first of all, the land belonged to us since the times of Avram Avinu.
Don't start with politics here.
No, but secondly, the halacha is the same with challah. If you have if the flour of a goy If a guy makes flour, if a guy makes dough, and you buy the dough off of him, I'm not sure that there's a chiyuv challah there. There's only a chiyuv challah if you make the dough. So what's the difference if I'm looking at Trumas and Meisers and the guy owns it at the time that it grows versus challah where the guy owns it when it became dough? So the ownership portion, I think, is parallel from Truma to challah because it's not relevant, the long-term history. At the time of the miruach, at the time where the gemar malach occurs, did it belong to a yid or a guy? And if it belonged to a yid, you'd be chayiv, even though it was the guy's earlier. And that's no different than challah. If it belongs to a guy at the time of the chiyiv, at the time of the lisha, then it's also potter from challah. So I don't see why that there should be a difference. It's just a time of the gemar malacha lagabeit. But as far as a guy's ownership in it, I don't think it makes a difference.
No, I was comparing because I thought challah is if you make the dough. You said now if you buy the raw dough from the guy, I wasn't comparing it to that case. So raw dough from the guy,
but it depends
right,
who it belonged to at the time of the trigger. So the trigger by challah is the lisha. The trigger by Trumas HaMaishos is, let's say, the miruach. It has to belong to a yid at the time of the trigger.
Okay.
Okay, so let's see the Gemara weiter. And as far as ownership is concerned, the other comment is it's all exer sakosov of when the Torah wants you to start giving Trumas HaMaishos. So if the Torah said b'vayachem, which it says by challah, means start giving challah now. The Torah says kisavayu mokam sheyukar. The Torah is saying I don't want you to give yet. So you want to give. You're actually kind of the crop.
Yeah, I understand that, but yeah, but that's not what. There's a difference fundamentally of when the chiyuv occurs. That's what I mean. When does the chalois take place? A dough is not going to take place. If a guy never makes enough dough for challah, he'll never be chayiv. Trumas and Meisters is chayiv right away as soon as he owns the land, as soon as the
chiyuv comes at the gemar malacha. Before the gemar malacha, there is no chiyuv. Right? That's why you're allowed to eat without being mavish Trumas and Meisters before the gemar malacha. Okay, so let's see what we have over here. Elo Amar Ravina. Ravina says we're back to the drawing board. How is it possible to have two cutoffs? The cutoff of miruach, the cutoff of disha, is much earlier in the siddur de pas than the lisha. Siddur de pas is the multiple steps from planting the grain until actually making the bread, having the bread completed. So in that list of chores that needs to get done, the miruach, the disha, is long before the lisha. So when would the lisha ever be relevant? El Amar Ravina, Zok Ravina, we don't have a steer in brises. We don't have one brisa saying lisha and one brisa saying dush. It's actually to be read combined. Keroich v'tani, dayish, madayish miyuchad davar shal nigmar melachtai lemaiser ulachala upayel oichelbay. In order for there to be an iser for the poil to eat, you needed to either have had a gemar malacha of meiser or a gemar malacha of poil. Avkol shalei nigmar malachta lemaiser ulachala poil oichelbay. And Rashi explains different products have a different gemar malacha. If I'm making bread, the gemar malacha lagabe this halacha of the poil being able to eat is not by the disha. All I have is grain. I got a lot more to do to make it into bread. So if we're baking bread, if that's what our final destination is, then the gemar malacha isn't until it is needed, till not it's needed with a K, until it's in the dough form. So therefore, there the poil can eat up until this point. But what if I'm merely harvesting dates or figs, or I plan to eat the kernels by roasting them? Well, for that process, there the end goal is either picking it off the tree, or the end goal might be bringing it into your house, or the end goal might be the threshing. For that, the poil has to stop eating it there. So it really depends on what is going to be done with these payers. Whatever it's planned to do with it, when you hit that Kamar Malacha, the poil can no longer eat. Beautiful. Now we have a whole new shayla. The poil is allowed to eat from the fruit as he is processing. But there are exceptions, because we learned yesterday you're allowed to eat grapes if you're harvesting them, but you're not allowed to eat grapes if you dip them into salt. And Rashi explains, because that makes it more appetizing and will allow someone to eat more grapes than he would typically eat. And the Torah is not giving the poil so much. The poil is giving him the amount of grapes he would eat without that extra appetizer of dipping it into salt. So that we know that Veloy Anovim Umelach, Veloy Anovim V'Davar Acher. That's what the Gemara taught us yesterday. But now we have a different question. What if I enhance the appetizing nature of this food, not by adding to it, but by doing something else? I want to eat grain, but if you singe the grain in fire, it sweetens it and makes it like a candy. We know there's something called kaloyos. They used to give them out as candies to the children. So is the poil allowed to do that, thereby sweetening it, making it more appetizing, and therefore he'll eat more? Is he allowed to do that? Would it be disallowed? Because just like anovim and dover acher, where the salt gives him a greater appetite and makes the food more appetizing, that we don't allow. Or maybe not, because here I'm not adding anything. I'm doing a process on it. Who said that's what the Torah out? So Tashma, the Gemara spends the whole Amid Beis trying to bring a raya to this shayla. Tashma, Rishoy balabais lahashkes pay alam yayin kidei shelo yoichlu anovim harbe. The balabais has a right to offer wine to the poyalim, because if you drink wine, we learned that wine makes you satiated, and then they're not going to eat so many grapes. The balabais is allowed to do that. On the flip side, Rishoyim poyalim l'tavel pitam b'tzir, they're allowed to dip their bread into some salty solution, because when you eat bread with a salty solution, it enhances your appetite. It will enhance their appetite to eat more grapes. You see it's allowed? You see it's allowed? So why shouldn't I be able to singe the kloyos? It should be no different than dipping my bread, which gives me a greater appetite. And for the Gemara, turning on to Amid Beis, Lachshure Gavra Loi Kami Baila. We have no suffix that you're allowed to season yourself, you're allowed to condition yourself to have a greater appetite. Dipping your bread, that you're allowed to do. The question here is, are you allowed to do something to the actual food that you're allowed to eat from the balabayas? So Lachshur Gavra Loi Kami Baila. Ki Kami Baila and Lachshur Peir. Are you allowed to do something to the peri to make the peri more appetizing? What's the halacha? Tashma. So the Gemara now tries to bring a second raya. So we brought one raya that was neutralized. Now we're going to attempt to bring a second raya. Tashma. You know where the poilim take the grapes from when they're eating on the job? From the edges of the row. You know why? Because those are more exposed to the sun and they're sweeter. So those are the ones that they eat. But in the middle of the road, they don't get as much sun. The grapes are not going to be as sweet. Uvilvad zokt the brisa shelo yivhavu yahavavu ba'or. They're not allowed to take grapes and heat them up to make them sweeter. So this seems to be a brisa saying black and white. You're not allowed to heat them up to make them taste better. Zokt Gemara, there the reason why they weren't allowed to heat it up has nothing to do with enhancing the appetizing nature of the food. That's because who's paying them to do that? So we're not clearing bittul malacha. Bittul malacha, for sure, they're not allowed to do anything to waste time. Kikami boilan, our shaila is just looking at the parish himself, doing something to enhance its appetizing qualities. What if his wife and children were there and it didn't waste any time? They would be able to heat up the grapes for him, and then he'll be able to eat more. That's our shaila. The bride is not allowed because he was going to eat it up by himself and waste time. He's not allowed to waste time on the job. But what if he has assistants, his children, his wife, who's going to do it for him, so it won't take away from his time on the job, but it'll still make it more appetizing? Again, we still don't have a raya to our shaila. So
This could be a little bit of klutz kasha, but at the moment he picks it up to eat it for himself, who owns it? Does he own it, or does the balabas always own it?
It seems from what we've learned so far that he's going to own it because the Gemara said we needed a pasuk to tell us that it's not like a mekach, because a mekach would be mechuyev, and this we don't. The Torah says this is not a mekach. The Torah says this is just that Hakadosh Baruch Hu said that the poyalim have a right to eat.
So it's a matana.
It's a right to eat it. Let's look at the lashon of Rashi. Rashi says, a little back here a little bit.
I thought when you said Ishtar Ivana was there, he could sneak out a few for them as well.
Right? No, he's not. That's
he's
not
allowed to do it.
I don't think so. The Mechai, listen, 1 second. Let's see what it says over here.
What's that sign in the hotel? This is breakfast, not a supermarket.
Nishkan Grocery.
Nishkan Grocery.
1 second. Let's see if we have it over here. We had a Rashi on it. Let me just see if I can find it.
Okay, you don't have to go back for me, Yosy. That's,
there's a Rashi who says that there's a difference between Mekach and this schus that the Torah was mezake him with. Let me just see if it's over here. Move down over here 1 second. Oh, here it is. Af poil oichel upater. This is at the bottom of Pezai Namud Beis. But we don't say hoil de ba'agre ochil, since it's like part of his pay package that he's getting to eat on the job. Al korchoi shabalabais, even though the balabais wouldn't want, the balabais has to let him do this. Havalik a mekach. You don't say it's like he bought it. And umekach kavas l'maiser. We don't say that. Rather, we say it's not a mekach. It's just because the Torah lets him eat it. Okay, so let's see the Gemara weiter. We're going to now try another raya. So again, the shaila is: are you allowed to enhance the food by heating it up, and that's going to make it taste better? Tashma lo yahav ba'ar b'yochel. You're not allowed to heat it up. V'lo yichmar ba'adama. You're not allowed to bury it in hot soil, hot sand, which has the same effect. V'yochel. You're not allowed to do that. V'lo yafrach al gavasela. You're not allowed to smash it against a rock, which also, I guess, has some sweetening effect. What you could do is mafrich al yad boil. You could break it up in your hands and eat. I'm not sure. Maybe you're breaking up pears, you're breaking shells, or you're getting rid of the chaff of grain, whatever it is. But you're allowed to do that. But the problem is, it says lo yahavev ba'ar, so that's right away a raya to our shaila, and you're not allowed to do that. So tomorrow, once again. There, who said the reason why it's lo yahavev is because it's sweetening it? Maybe it's lo yahavev because it takes time to do. Hasa mishum bitl malacha. And zok gemara hachanami mistabra. This particular brisa, we don't just need to say it's because of bitl malacha, and not because you're enhancing the fruit. Because if you look at the other cases in this brisa, it's clear that it's not a question of enhancing the flavor of the fruit. It's merely because of wasting time. When you throw something at a rock to bust open the shell, that doesn't sweeten the peri. Yet the brisa prohibits it, obviously, because it wastes time. So that's not a raya. Because efshir the lememtic porta. You're right. You might not be throwing it on the rock to sweeten it, but it does have some sweetening effect, and maybe that is why the brisa is outlining it. You don't have a raya, but the brisa is discussing bittul malacha. So it can go either way, but still you don't have a raya. So we're back to square one. Are you allowed to singe these kernels in the fire to make it taste better? Tashma, payalim shahayu oidrin betain. Now, the Lashon HaKodesh is a very chashuv language because in English, the word that we use to describe cutting wheat, cutting barley, cutting anything is the word harvest. It's a general rule. But Lashon HaKodesh is much more specific. Every different type of harvest has a separate word. So oidrin betainim, when you're harvesting the dates, Figs, that's called oidrim. The goidrim b'tamarim, when you're harvesting dates, it's called goidrim. Uboitrim b'novim, when you're harvesting grapes, it's called boitzer. Umoiskim b'zaisim, and when you're harvesting olives, it's called moisik. In all these cases, harei elu oichlin upeturin. In all these cases, the employees are allowed to eat from it, and upturin, and they don't have to take meiser. So even though they're allowed to eat from it, they're still potter for meiser. Why would they be chayiv in meiser? Again, to address what Akiva raised earlier, upturim in a meiser v'loy amrinon mekach. We don't say the right that they have to eat is like a purchase. You know why? This is not one of the one of the details of their remuneration package. It's not part of their pay package. It's a completely separate gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Torah gave it to them. So therefore, it doesn't have that their abundant kamaila of achshuvei that it would be mechuyev in meisos. The Torah was mezakeh to them. Because of that, I'm still not 100% sure how to answer Akiva. Did the Torah give it to them as a matana, or they're just allowed to eat it? Torah is zichsalahem. It sounds like zichsalahem means not Torah was just matin them to eat. The Torah gave it to them as a gift, as a matana, but it's still not enough of an achshavei that it would be mechayev you in mice. Okay, zogt the brayse weiter. Bepitam lo yoichlu. They shouldn't eat these fruit together with their bread. Why? Unless they got rishus from the balabais, and Rashi explains why. Because if you eat these things with bread, you're likely to eat more than typical. And the Torah didn't give them that much. The Torah just gave them the right to eat what they would eat by itself, not more than they would eat by themselves if it was accompanied with bread. Okay, and now the Brisa sticks in another important halacha. Don't dip these grapes into salt and eat them. Now, if you remember, we learned this earlier. That's called anovim b'davar acher, right? So you're not allowed to do that. So this is very much from a choshev mishpat perspective. You're not allowed to dip fruit into salt because that will give you more. It'll give you a bigger appetite and make the food more appetizing to eat more. That's not allowed.
Yossi, just to defend the English language, I agree with you with Hebrew. I know it's another sidebar, but in English, a group of animals have a specific name, like a flock of sheep, a gaggle of geese, a school of fish. Hebrew, in Lashon Kodesh, I don't think we have that. I don't think so.
Okay, I hear it. V'lo yisbois b'melach v'yoichal. You're not allowed to dip it into melech. So it seems from here that well, what is the problem? It seems like the problem is Rashi says it's because of a choshev mishpat. So you see from here that you're not allowed to enhance pears. So maybe there's a problem with singeing the grain as well. Zakt Gemara, that's not a kasha. Melech vaday kanovim b'davar achadam. Melach is mamish, eating grapes with something else. That we already learned from the pasuk that's not allowed. We want to know if you do a process on the grain like singeing it, so there's nothing else that you're eating it by itself. You're doing something to it itself. That maybe the trier is not outlined. Maybe that's not what the Brisa says. It's only if you're dipping it into something else. But if it was by itself and you enhance it by heating it, who said that wouldn't be allowed? So we've neutralized the fourth raya. So we don't have a raya. We remain with the shaila whether or not the employee is allowed to eat these kernels when they're singed and they're more appetizing. But now the Gemara is going to go back in to analyze the brayta we just focused on. We said a moment ago, you're not allowed to dip the grapes into salt and eat them. Is that true? You're not allowed to dip into salt? Is that something that's not allowed? So the Gemara is challenging not just this brisa, but what we learned yesterday as well, that you're not allowed to dip grapes into salt and eat it. The Gemara is going to challenge it because we have a brisa that seems to teach us otherwise. You hired somebody la'ader ulakashkesh tachas aseisim. So this is not work by the Gemar Malach. Ader is to dig a trench around the tree so that it'll contain water for irrigation. And kashkesh is if any roots pop up above the ground, you would cover them with soil to protect them. So that's surely not the Gemar Malacha. So therefore, when you're doing such a job, you have no right to eat any payers. Hareza lo yoichal. He's not allowed to eat anything. But tzorcher livsar, but if he was hired to harvest, socher limsoi, socher lalake, these are all harvesting payers. Hareza oichel. There he's allowed to eat, because that's by the harvest we already established that the workers are allowed to eat for the payers. And do potter, and he's also going to be potter from Meiser, because it's not called a mekach memkar shatayra zichsa lahen. Okay, so far so good. Remember, what we're challenging is the la yispois b'melach. We haven't touched that yet, so let's go on in the price. Kotzatz. What happens if I made up with my employer that I'm allowed to eat from the payers? So you might ask, anyway, I'm allowed to eat from the payers. The Torah was zoicha to me. True, but maybe he was conscious that he should be able to have even after Gemar Malacha, or maybe it's by things that this wouldn't be relevant to. Tosha speaks out cases where he wouldn't otherwise be able to get it from the Torah. So Tosha says it could be referring to if he was hired to do Idor or Kishkush, which are not Gemar Malacha things, but they made a deal that he was going to be able to eat. So if they made a deal he's going to be able to eat, achas yoicha. He's allowed to take one peri at a time and eat it, and we won't say, because this is almost like a mekach. When do we say it's not like a mekach? That's if he ate only because the Torah was mazaketin. But if he made an individual deal with the balabais as part of his pay package, now that's like a mekach. So oy bazoi, the mekach itself establishes it as a chiyav meiser. Therefore, achas yoicha. Because even though it's a mekach, one at a time is never something that would be considered digmar malacha because of achshave, and we learned that from a pasuk that the Gemara brings all the way to the bottom of the Umm. But shtayim lo yoichal. If he wants to eat two at a time, that wouldn't be allowed, because the moment he takes two and we consider it like a mecher, it now is considered nigmar malach meiser, and he's not allowed to eat it without being mafish meiser. And now the Brisa throws in an extra line that we have no idea what the Brisa means. The soifes, the melach, the and you are allowed to dip it into salt and eat. So this is directly against our understanding that you're not allowed to do it. But first we have to know this halacha that the Brisa says at the end, the soifes, the melach, the is that saying it's not a problem of gemar malacha for meiser, or is that talking about it's not a problem of eating when you don't have a right to eat? So we first need to get clear what this line of the Brisa is addressing. Ahaya. Exactly what case of the Brisa that we've discussed until now is it talking about? Because we had the earlier case where it was loy kotzatz, we had the later case where it's kotzatz. What's it going on? Ilay ma'aseifa. If it's going on the case of kotzatz, so we're talking about the employee made a deal with the employer that he's allowed to eat the payers. If he made a deal that he's allowed to eat the payers, then it doesn't make a difference if he dipped it in salt or not. Dipping in salt is only a problem if your only right to eat it is because the Torah gave it to you, but the Torah doesn't let you eat when you dip it in salt. But if you made a deal with your employer that I'm allowed to eat, then it doesn't make a difference what I do with it. It doesn't make a difference how I enhance my appetite. Even the kotzatz, the boy lecha, he should be able to eat it. So it doesn't make sense that the Mishnah is the Brisa is telling for service for melech v'yoichel to address a case of where it was kotzatz. Elalav Reisha, I must be going on the Reisha, where it was not kotzatz, and my only right to eat these grapes are because the Torah said I can eat them, and the Brisa says I'm allowed to dip it in salt. So how could you tell me that the schus that the Torah gives you excludes dipping into salt? The Brisa here says you're allowed to dip it into salt. Amar Abaye, Zok Abaye loikash. It's not fair. Kan ba'oretz, kan b'chutz la'aretz. What does that have to do with anything? Zok to Gemara. Ba'aretz kava svisa, b'chutz la'aretz loy kava svisa. So Abaye said, no, this service b'melech v'yoichel is not addressing the choshen mishpat question as to whether or not the employee can eat from it or not. Avada once it's soifes b'melech, you're not allowed to eat it anymore because the Torah's limitation of granting the employee this is limited to the fruit alone. But we're talking about in the case of kata, so he's allowed to eat it anyway. He's allowed to eat anything. The question is, maybe once you dip it into salt, that's koiveya l'maiser. So merely taking won't be koiveya l'maiser. But if you dip it into salt, it'll be koiveya l'maiser. The Zokta Gemara, kan ba'aretz, kan b'chutz la'aretz. Ba'aretz kavas visa. In Eretz Yisrael, where meiser perishes d'oraisa, there, by dipping into salt, we're going to say that it's kavet lemeiser, and therefore you're not allowed to eat it anymore. And that would mean even achas achas, because we already established time, regardless, is considered kfiyas. But achas achas would be usher even by itself, because it's kavet. And the sefer speaking of chutz la'aretz, where it's like kavas visa. The chutz la'aretz, where anyway meiser perishes only midrabanan, there the svisa doesn't have an impact. So this brayta that we just learned, the soifes b'melech v'yoichal, is referring to chutz la'aretz, where anyway, since meiser derabanan, we won't say that dipping it into salt would be kavet l'meiser. Amar Rav said that makes no sense, because mi kamidi, you ever find a case dibe aretz kavas visa midaraisa in Eretz Yisrael, dipping it into salt is kavayit, and midaraisa there's a chiyuv trumas and maisros. Ubechutz la'aretz, where the Rabbanon made a takana to be mechayiv the Paris in trumas and maisros, like kavas visa mutlach atchila. Isn't there a concept that kol takana that the Rabbanon make it's kein deraisa? So if deraisa it's aser, they should say that the chutz la'aretz should also be aser midrabanan. Why is the brayta saying l'chatchila soifes the melech v'yoy? So therefore, Rava rejects Abaye's teretz. Elamar Rava, bein be'aretz, bein b'chutz la'aretz. Sai in Eretz Yisrael, sai in chutz la'aretz. Whatever we have, midaraisa b'Eretz Yisrael, we have midarabanan in chutz la'aretz. Chada loikav. If there was only one that you dipped into salt, it's not kaveyet l'maiser, but lekavas visa. But tarti kavas visa. But if you ate two together, the svisa, the dipping it into salt, will make it mechuyev in maisros. That's anything, whether it was kotetz or not. If you're eating two together, dipping it into salt, it's going to trigger a chiyuv maisros. Kotetz. What if I made a deal with the employer? I'm allowed to eat as much as I want. Then bein safas ubein loy safas. Even if you dip it, even if you did not dip it into salt, achas achas oichel. You're allowed to eat one at a time, because merely buying one at a time does not kaveyet l'maiser. But shtayim loy oichel. But two at a time you shouldn't. And if it's loy katatz v'loy safas, then you can even eat oichel shtayim. So therefore, safas, if you dipped into salt, achas oichel. But if you dipped into salt, shtayim lo yoichel. So let's stop here a minute. So we're discussing really svisa lagabi bin kaveh l'maiser, and what we're saying is that if it was not kotzatz, then svisa has no impact, because if it was not kotzatz, eating one at a time is not kaveh l'maiser. Eating two at a time is kaveh l'maiser, even without dipping into salt. If it was kotzatz, there we said, if it was kotzatz and you ate one at a time, it's not kaveh l'maiser, and therefore there's no problem. You're allowed to eat it. But eating two at a time is kaveh l'maiser. But by kotzatz, if there was savisa, and therefore, and if it was kotzatz and there's fisa, then again, svisa has no impact at all. So let's see this again. Nacham, alamar bein bar bein chutz la'aretz, chada loy kavas svisa, tardi kavas svisa. So kotzatz, bein safas, bein loy safas, achas oichel, shtayim loy oichel, and svisa doesn't help at all, because svisa only helps by two, and by two at a time anyway, it's kaveh l'maiser without the dipping in the salt. If it was loy kotzatz v'loy safas, again, you can eat two at a time. You can even eat two at a time. So 1 second. So I have to back up. By kotzatz, Bein safas, bein loy safas, achas achas oichel, shtaim shtaim loy oichel. But if it's a loy katzatz and it's loy safas, oichel shtaim shtaim. You can even eat two at a time, and two at a time will not be kaveya l'maiser. Safas, achas, achas, oichel. And even if you're a safas, if it's one at a time, you're allowed to eat, because svisa doesn't help less than two. Shtaim, shtaim, lo yoichal. But if it was two at a time, then you're allowed to eat it. Then you're not allowed to eat it. The kavas visa. So let's get this very, very clear. If it was loy katzat, so you're only eating because the Torah allows you to eat it, then whether you eat one at a time or two at a time, you didn't buy it. There's no kaviyas at all. There's no chiyav meiser at all. By katzat, there could be a potential. There could be a potential of a chiyav for meiser. So we say if you eat two together, you're not allowed to eat by katzats because that's kaveya. But eating one, even by katzats, would not be kaveyat l'maiser. Okay. Now, if it was so basically, safas doesn't have any impact really at all on two, only on one. So basically, when the Bryce over here says the soy face, the melech v'yoichel, it's because dipping it into salt doesn't really have any impact. Because dipping it into salt only has an impact on two. And if it was loy katzatz, there's never ever an issue because Psi 1 and Psi 2 together, you're allowed to eat because there's no mekach. If it was katzatz and there's a mekach, eating two together, even without svisa, would be aser. So the svisa doesn't really make a difference. So let's read it again inside. One alone, the svisa won't have an impact on. Tarti kava svisa. Two, it will be. However, katzatz, bein sofes, bein loy sofes, if it was katzatz, achas achas oichel, shtaim shtaim loy oichel, even without svisa, but loy katzatz, v'loy sofas, in a regular case where you're just eating from the employer, oichel shtaim shtaim, you're allowed to eat two at a time. Sofas, achas achas oichel, shtaim shtaim loy oichel. So here's where I have to correct what I said. If it was loy katzatz, if it was loy katzatz, you're allowed to eat two at a time, and there's no problem of kfis l'maiser. But if it was loy katzatz and you dipped it into salt, that is a kfis for meiser, and there you would not be able to eat two at a time, even though from a choshev mishpah you could, because the Bible you have the right to eat it. Nevertheless, you're not allowed to eat it because the itfahu l'maiser, the kavas visa, and since it's itfahu l'maiser, you can't eat it without separating kumas and maisers. Zok to Gemara, where do you know that two has significance? That their svisa will be kaveya, even if it was loy katzatz. V'tarti the kavas visa minolam. Amar Masna Damar Kra, he kavts on kamir gayrana because he gathered them together into the gayrin. So you see, in order for it to be a gemar malacha, that should be a kibbutz, a gathering. One you can't gather. The minimum required to gather is two. Okay, Gavaldik. So that takes us to the end of the sugya. So we learned two things. A, we learned it's a suffix l'matskana if you're allowed to enhance the flavor of what you're eating by singeing it. We also learned that dipping it into salt is not allowed if you're eating it because of the bilim letting you eat it because of the gzeres hakazav. If you're not allowed to dip it in salt because that enhances your appetite, and it's a great vidav or acher, that's not allowed. And lagave svisa's impact on being kaveh something l'maiser, it's as follows. The only time svisa has any real impact is if you're eating it because of the reshus that the Torah gives you, not because you made a deal. And you're eating two at a time and you're dipping it in the salt, that's where their svisa will make a difference. But if it was katzatz, eating two at a time anyway is kavala meiser. So svisa doesn't change anything because it'd be a chiyav meiser for that anyways. Okay, Baruch Hashem, we were zeicha to finish daf Peites, and Be'ez Hashem tomorrow we will learn tzaddik. Rabbi Levi, it's so nice to have you here. You should have a wonderful, wonderful day.